coming, and please eat lots of cakes because they've all got to go, and there's tea and coffee at the back as well to help yourselves. So yeah, I'm really excited about this presentation. I love the archives, and there's some really, I think there's some really cool stuff. Like it's interesting from a sort of social and wildlife point of view, isn't it? There's some quite charming details, but also for research, it's really important that some of the inventories of tussocks and things going back to the 50s and then comparisons in the 80s are really important if you're researching those areas, to make sure you go and look in the archives before repeating anything that might have been done in the past. So, yeah, so thanks guys for looking after it. So yeah, we've got Chloe and Helen and Emma here, and they're going to give us some presentations now. I've got a pad I'll pass around. If anyone's not on the mailing list for Peaty Pals, then do join up, and I think you've got some here too. Indeed. Yeah, so if you'd like to be added, just pop your, or I'll put it at the back, just pop your email address down on there. Thanks very much.
Excellent, good. Right, well, hello, welcome everyone. I'm really pleased to see so many of you. You make us extra nervous, but hopefully you're good, so thank you. I did say this earlier, but we will send a copy of the presentation around to you all. So if you can't read something, or if we go too quick, then you'll be able to catch up later. And we'll also send around any links or resources that we also include in here, just so that you've got some time again to research and have a bit of an explore yourself. Yes, so as we very kindly introduced ourselves, I'm Chloe, this is Helen, and Emma Jane, and yeah, we're very excited to be able to talk to you today about the peat records that we have in the National Archives here in the Falkland Islands. Hopefully I'm going to be able to... Technology, come on, let's work. No, okay, computer say...
You might touch the screen.
No.
You can swipe the screen.
Yeah. Okay, we'll just do it manually. Okay, great. So today we're going to be just first of all giving you a bit of an introduction to the Jane Cameron National Archives in case you haven't been there or don't know what information it contains. For the primary focus of today's discussion, we'll be looking at our government records that we have related to peat, which we have recently just digitised, so it's all come about in a very timely manner. We'll then be going through and kind of exploring some of our wider collections, some of our photographic collections, our periodicals, again, all in relation to peat, but just to show the kind of range of material that we have. We will then be finishing off just by providing you with information about how you can access our material both in person and also remotely, and then obviously have a bit of Q&A afterwards. Our presentation will be probably about 35 minutes to 40 minutes, so hopefully there'll be time at the end. Next slide. So a bit about ourselves, but I hate this part, so we'll move quickly on. So I am Chloe Anderson-Wheatley, for those of you who may not know me or not seen me before. For the locals in the room, I'm Eddie Anderson's daughter, and I'm the Corporate Records National Archives Manager. We have a broad remit for our directorate, managing the records management for FIG, and for managing the entire National Archives service. Helen?
I'm Helen McShane. I'm the Records and Archives Support Officer, so I assist Chloe in all the hard work that she does.
Hi, I'm Emma Jane. I'm a geography student at the University of Exeter, and while I'm home on break, I've been doing work experience placement with Chloe and Helen at the archives. As part of that, I've been helping to digitise some of the records, including the peat ones and some other natural history topics too.
So the brief introduction. So the Jane Cameron National Archives, for those who don't know, is situated along Jeremy Moore Avenue in Stanley. Our mission is basically to preserve and provide access to the historical records of the islands and those important to the administration. So we, as a facility, are very broad ranging in terms of the services that we provide. But we, in terms of the contents of the records, have records that are almost 200 years old, so from the 1830s, from when the first, well, not really, one of the first British settlers came. So yes, we have a broad history. We have our dedicated reading room where you can come in and provide physical access to the records. We have this is our building, and then this is our conservation workshop, which allows us to be able to preserve and care for the records. Now for a little coincidental reference here, lots of you will probably be aware of Robin Woods, who's written all the books. So his nephew Chris Woods is actually in charge of a separate field of conservation entirely, but the National Conservation Service in the UK. And so he essentially helps us and provides one-to-one support in terms of how we can kind of support our collections care. So Robin obviously more in terms of conserving nature, and Chris in terms of the records. But it's really great to have people who are connected with the Falklands.
Well, as Chloe said, our records are sort of spanning roughly 200 years, so it's amazing really for such a small archives in such a small location that we've got over 30,000 records, not just the government correspondence in the letterbooks and sort of things by theme of department, directorate or industry that was going on, but we've also got independent individuals, photographic collections. We've got the whole of the FIC archives, the Falkland Islands Company archives, and we also have a huge range of maps and plans and a growing audio-visual collection as well. So we've got a huge range of material.
So, as we all know, the archives are situated in Jeremy Avenue. Previous to the building being constructed back in 1998, it would be no surprise, the records were kind of stored ad hoc across many government buildings. The legal records were initially actually stored in the original town hall. That then burnt down, and unfortunately a few of the Crown grants were horribly damaged. Some of them were rescued. Material then got stored in the Secretariat, particularly government records. That then burnt down in 1959, but thankfully a lot of the material was salvaged, so it wasn't a huge loss. From the Secretariat they then moved to the top floor of the Public Jetty Centre, and they were there from 1977 until the building that we have today was finished, and then that moved and subsequently allowed us to start cataloguing and really providing access to the material. So these are a few terms and definitions relating to peat. I'm sure a lot of you probably already know them. I have also taken them from Sam Miller's wonderful Jane and Alistair Cameron History Project, which he did when he was in Year 6. So if you see him, you can tell him that we've taken it. But also just because it's really fascinating to see all the different terminology that is used when you talk about peat. It all seems quite simple, but it's quite an impressive list if you start putting it all together.
So peat has been a fundamental aspect of Falklands life throughout the island's history. It was historically used as the principal fuel source for heating and cooking, and the abundance of the peat banks in Stanley was one of the contributing factors in Governor Moody's decision to move the main settlement from Port Louis to Stanley. In the archives we have the letterbooks, which contain Governor Moody's first extensive report and comments on a range of aspects that he found noteworthy about the Falklands. We can see that he says here, the soil is of a very fine dark, almost peaty quality. It's compact and from 6 inches to 2 feet in depth, lying upon a subsoil of gravelly clay. He then goes on to say that the fuel is abundant in the form of the excellent peat, which is the black kind, and extremely compact, and when well dried, it makes a bright fire and gives out great heat.
Can't see it very well. So, carrying on looking at the dispatches, he starts to sort of go into more detail, like thinking about the infrastructure of moving to Stanley and the benefits sort of being around Port William. And for one, the peat was an attractive option there because there were so many potential peat banks surrounding the Port William area in Stanley. He was sort of thinking as well about the fact that the ships, the steamers coming in could benefit from getting the peat from there, so there would be sort of potential commercial benefits as well. He estimated that the consumption would be around 300 million cubic yards of peat, so he had high expectations.
And so this is a part of the letter book where they've moved to Port William, moved here to Stanley, and Moody's setting out his plan for how he wants to develop the settlement here. But again, kind of leading on to what's already been discussed, again, he's making reference to the fact that peat is so close to people's houses, within 200 to 300 yards of every man's house. So already you can see how big part of it was going to be for the community and for making sure that, people could survive from day to day.
So the first box of government records that we have covers the period 1916 to 1948. And within this, it contains some information about the seasonal tenders and contracts. for peat cutting, which were annually put out for tenders to cut and rickle for various properties across Stanley. This includes the government house, the town hall and the hospital. We can also see the amounts that they needed. So the hospital annually required 365 loads and the town hall 650 loads. On the graphs to the side there, we can see on the top one, it shows the number of properties that received peat over a 7 to 8 year period from 1919. And we can see that there's an increase of around 7 properties over this period. And then the bottom graph shows that the cubic yards that were cut over these yearly seasons, and we can see an increase from 6,600 to 9,450 cubic yards over that same 7 to 8 year period. The records are also really interesting because they can show us the names of individuals that were given contracts, so such as George Newing, Stephen Kiddle, and particularly interesting, you can really see some of the familiar local names start to emerge at this point. So we've got Bonner, Biggs, Summers, Peck, just to name a few on that list. And it also notes that the position of the government peat officer was held by Stephen Aldridge in 1948-49.
And just a side note with that is that a lot of the tenders and contracts were managed by the PWD office until they had the official kind of government peat officer. It used to be by the colonial engineer, but ultimately it still sat with PWD, and so they made sure that everyone was cutting their peat the right sizes, and we can tell you there was a right size to cut your peat, but also that they followed the 1924 peat bank rules as well, which were quite strict in terms of cutting peat on Stanley Common.
They also they show the technical challenges that would have been faced by some of these contracted people. So a lot of peat cutters, they face shortage of transport at times for carting their peat to Stanley residents. One file explained that Mr. Kiddle, his lorry was in a bad condition. He needed to be aided by the army to transport the peat, but they would only do it in return for the payment that he would have received ordinarily. And here's just an example of a contract for cutting and rickling 3,000 cubic yards. It's signed by George Newing in 1919, and it lays out the agreed upon terms between him and the foreman of works, including the quantity, location, payment and the size of the peat sods.
And with all of this, at the outset, the government were particularly interested in exploring ways that peat could be used within the community, but also used commercially at an industrial kind of level. They're very keen, obviously, at making it an economic benefit to the islands. But one of the first things that they had to do was to basically send peat samples and for analysis and scientific research to the UK. They sent it to Scotland, but they also sent it to other institutions. Like the Rowett Institute in Aberdeen, in Chile as well, and these samples being analysed is then really important because they could then use that information to know whether they were able to, explore or expand it in certain industries, particularly making briquettes or in terms of extracting any wax that could potentially be from within the minerals there, and also for looking for bacterized peat. This screenshot here just essentially says that unfortunately this is going to be a common theme across the presentation, that they try things and realise it's not going to work. And so yes, unfortunately it wasn't going to be useful for bacterisation for peat. We then have other commercial considerations, so whether they want to, because again we have so much peat, whether it could be transported to Chile or South America for their markets. But again, the cost of production was going to be too high and it wouldn't provide any economic value. And as we see, this will continue through the presentation.
So we've got some great correspondence between Arthur George Bennett, who was the FIG, the government naturalist. We've actually just written an article about him in our upcoming newsletter, so if you do read it, please look out for it. But they're sort of exploring that idea of potentially being able to create bacterialised peat here. So he was trying to correspond with a chap called Professor Bottomley, so a great name, and he was the chap that discovered that you could use bacteria to fertilise peat. So he tried writing to him without much success, and then got in touch with the Clarence Elliott Limited Company, who had taken up the sort of commercial element of bacterised peat. And there wasn't much love lost between them, with Elliott writing, he's the most unbusinesslike man He might have made a future out of bacterialised peat if he'd looked after it, but he seemed to neglect every opportunity. And unfortunately, they just decided it wasn't a viable option in the end for the Falklands, but they did have quite a bit of correspondence discussing it and looking at transporting some here, which is quite interesting to read.
And then here you can see some of the results that have come back from the UK from the analysis of the peat. I'm not going to pretend that I know what any of it means, but again, they would have used this information to be able to then have further information about the peats that we actually have in the Falklands and then see how that can be expanded. Here we then have an example of other types of natural history resources that were also sent to the UK for analysis. So here they send diddle-dee and other grass and things like that so that they can be analysed. Again, just to see, learn a bit more about the Falklands, and particularly from the UK side, that would be very interesting for their people, but also really just to see if anything else could be monopolised for the Falklands.
And then here we've just got some snippets from box 1 of our government records, just some interesting points in there. So on the far right we can see there's a list of peat requirements in 1922 and 23, so it shows the buildings and the amount they would have required, totalling 3,000 loads for this season in particular. On the bottom we can see that it demonstrates how the increase from 8,100 cubic yards to 9,000 cubic yards was necessary in order to supply this growing amount of properties, but also to maintain a good government reserve stock. In the top, it just notes that the system of allocations was working quite well, with minimal disputes and minimal encroachment on other people's territory. And then in the middle, it's just part of a correspondence with advice about growing certain seeds. And one individual humorously notes that he had no idea the Falklands were the Fiji.
Apologies, that was me.
So the second box spans the records from 1946 to 1968, and it focuses more on the arrangements concerning the delivery of peat for government officers and to the government locations like the town hall and such. And they listed the amount of cartloads that were given to the houses. This was particularly for people in roles in government where they probably didn't have time to cut their own peat, or they weren't necessarily here all year round, like the customs officer who would probably spend quite a bit of time on South Georgia as well. So you can see, I think in one of our later slides we've got a list sort of showing that a little bit more. They also, this box also looks a bit more into the industrialisation of peat, looking at the options of whether it could be used for briquetting or for power generation. And at that time the Falkland Islands Company were really exploring this, and they were looking to build a peat briquetting factory in the Falklands. And they also had samples of peat tested for commercial wax. As it goes on, this is sort of a common theme throughout the records, but they decided that it was quite similar to the level of wax that you get in peat in the UK, so there wasn't much need to pursue it here. There's also quite a bit of correspondence about peat drying and the science behind the process. Obviously they were hoping that if conditions were good for drying the peat in the Falklands, it'd be easier to transport it and to prepare it quicker, but as we know, weather conditions aren't always reliable or favourable, and I think they realised quite quickly it just was not going to be a viable option for the amount, and also the cost of transportation of the peat as well was going to be very problematic. So here, there's some just examples here of how they sort of logged the peat deliveries that they were doing. So here's for the senior school, and you can just sort of see how many loads they were having to produce. There's some quite large numbers. And also who it was that delivered the peat. I think this was probably to avoid any difficult conversations and arguments about whether the peat was delivered at the right place and at the right time. And here there's an example of the sales of peat to private individuals as well.
And then here we have is this yours?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So also in box 2, it discusses and contains some correspondence about the options for peat machinery, so including the treads, attachments, and what would be the most valuable and efficient. In the telegram sent from the Governor to the Secretary of State at the bottom there, We can see that he notes that they've ordered a rower machine in 1953 to cut peat, and then we see in a later reply in 1954 that the Public Works Department say it arrived and it proved to be a success.
It is me now. So also in this file we have some more information relating to purchasing or maybe examining different pieces of equipment that would also be required. So there were different opportunities for people both locally to go abroad. So for example, they went, you can see here is an extract from A.G. Barton, who went to visit Sweden and Denmark to be able to actually see what other people were doing with their peat and try to get some advice and recommendations on what would be best and what could be effectively applied to the Falkland Islands. In addition to this, there was also correspondence with the Irish Turf Board in Ireland and the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research. There was also an opportunity for a Danish peat expert to come down in the mid-1950s. However, what is particularly funny from the correspondence is that there's not really a mention to do with the results of that lovely expert coming down. It's a fight between the government and the FIC deciding who's going to pay or basically, after he's visited, then pay for all the flights and the travel and the expense that has caused from his visit. So that is particularly funny. And then some more information about the peat cutting machines, and essentially saying that even though the FIC have offered the government a peat cutting machine for them to use, PWD are very kindly, politely declining their request, but don't want to use that machine. So you get a bit of an insight into how the private and public sector also work together in those days. So maybe not much has changed. And then here we have, because obviously it's Helen saying, peat drying was a really huge consideration because that would then impact on the success of any other viable businesses. The governor at the time was really keen to be able to provide some statistics on peat drying, and so they then developed a very, very complicated formula, which, it worked then. A very complicated formula which they then used to calculate basically the drying rate of peat. And then here are some summaries of their results. But ultimately, all the results showed was that, again, nothing was going to work when it came to peat because it wasn't, the peat wasn't going to be a viable product. And again, when you compare it to other sources of material like coal or anything else, it just wasn't going to be cost effective at all. But again, great statistics to have.
So in our third and final box, which spans from 1963 to 1993, there's a lot more of looking at sort of the supply of peat and re-examining the terms of the contracts and sort of reviewing how the processes worked. In 1965, they were decided that more authority was needed for the peat officer, and they looked here on the right, you can see that they're sort of looking at provisions for revising the peat bank rules of 1924 to sort of allow the peat officer a bit more authority. There's some quite funny correspondence in that box where somebody called the police because another chap had walked across his peat bog and was using it as a shortcut, and he was very unhappy about this. So I think the hope was that the peat officer could mediate some of these disputes a little more than perhaps them having to go as far as law enforcement. They also wanted to review the list of people receiving peat so they could sort of keep track of how things were changing within the community, and also looking into the haulage of peat for customers, which was throughout the history of peat records was always a problematic issue, was transporting the peat to Stanley from the surrounding areas. They continued to explore the future of peat, but like we've said before, they were looking more at the Montan wax as they went on later, but again they were finding it just wasn't viable, and it wasn't going to be easy to sort of get here, to export from here, sorry. There's also a bit about the conversion to oil-fired central heating. So by 1966, a few of the government buildings, such as Sullivan House, Police Station, FIDF, all these were all now running off oil-fired central heating. So they sort of wanted again to sort of see how peat was being used. There were still buildings that were burning peat and peat dust, so there was some correspondence relating to that as well.
In box 3, there's also some. Oh, that's not me, is it? That's you. Oh no, that is me, I'm sorry. In Boxley there's also some correspondence from a Mrs. Stewart in 1965. She lives in Stanley and she's unable to cart her peat from the common, and she said that she's too elderly to do so, and she asks to be loaned some from the spare government stock. She believes that a Mr. Wallace has been helped in this way similarly before. She receives a reply from government explaining there is no spare stock they can loan her and that she is completely incorrect about Mr. Wallace. She further responds and she says, if there is no spare stocks in government, I think workmen could do without a fire. Those that have to work outside get no fire to work by, and I'm afraid we hear things at times that make us old people very cross.
Hear, hear.
And here is just a few more screenshots from those government records, just to show again then their considerations towards the Montan wax. And again, says the same old thing. It's just not going to happen. But what is really interesting is obviously we know that kelp was one of those industries where there was kind of to and froing, and we've had alginates and others that have then recently come back to see if it's a viable sector to develop, and they were basically referring to comparing peat to kelp and saying, well, why can't we try to see if it's still a solution? So even though, as we've said, all these results have shown that it's not going to be viable, there was still a particular enthusiasm and drive to make it viable. If we can make money, then we're going to do it.
So in addition to our government record collection, we also have a range of photographic collections in the archives, and within this there's quite a wide range that relate to peat directly. This slide just shows some varied images of peat and people from the early to late 1900s.
What behaviour now?
That's fine, it's all visual, so
You get a nice long look while I struggle.
There's some more people with some peat. Here we can see Jane Cameron on the side here. There's Doreen Butler in the middle, and a lovely young girl. We don't know the name of her, kind of a peat stack over there.
And then here we've just got some examples of the peat machinery. This one is from particularly from the FIC, the one that they introduced in the 1980s. I'm not going to try to pronounce the names of all of them. But again, if we can just emphasise how different machinery and thought processes towards how to best cut and rickle and do all the processes for peat, how that has changed and developed over the years.
At one point, just to add, they were finding it a bit problematic with the machine that they had at one point to try and remove the top sod, so they were looking at all the sort of handmade options of sort of scoops and things that could pull the top layer off. I think diddle-dee was what was causing the issue largely.
Yeah.
Actually, here's some examples that you'll all be quite familiar of different peat storage solutions. Having your stacks outside. Here someone's tried to cover theirs with a tarpaulin. And in the corner to the right, we've got the peat sheds. I'm sure Phyllis Feller will have memories of when the peat was slightly into the road and you end up with a quick hazard before you can throw it all in. And then just obviously the traditional peat buckets as well.
And we should say that this, or rather, Helen, do you want to?
Oh yes, so that is a picture of 11 Drury Street. And so it's a bit of a depressing story, but the original house there actually features in one of our other articles in the newsletter about a rather tragic fire that happened there. So just as an aside, it's it'll be featured in.
But we're not going to spoil it.
No, we'll save you the tragedy when you read it.
And then we've got some images here that just display life with peat for those living alongside it. So on the right side we've got a Rayburn goose green with some buckets of peat next to it, common sight in many Falkland Islands homes. In the middle we've got, this is 54 John Street, the Pig and Whistle is visible just to the left there. It's got no parking, there's this peat entrance, and then just on the left there's a lovely watercolour cartoon by Joe King in 1946 of what he calls the Kelper's headache.
Yes, I have memory of my own father and of near misses with the peat spade. We also have quite a few peat maps in our collection. These are just some close-ups from them because they're quite large, some of them. And they just sort of show the allocations and the locations of various peat bogs. Some of them have the names included, so the surnames, so you can sort of see where people were. Here there's some pencil sketches, so if you can't see it too well, this sort of shows the area sort of going from Surf Bay and the Canash towards Phillips Point, and sort of showing where those peat bogs were. And obviously in 82 access would have been lost to probably the majority of these bogs, and they're still there today obviously, but it would be interesting to see how it impacted people at the time, losing their sort of their area, their viable source of fuel. And over to the right, there's some more sort of from the Eliza Cove area, sort of where I suppose Teebury Way and the mobile homes are now. So there's a few more examples.
And then here we've just got some images of peat banks throughout different periods of time. These are quite interesting. Some range from the early 1900s to 2009 over there on the other side. Yeah, it's quite nice to see.
And just the layers as well over time. People have been cutting for a long period of time, building up, sort of showing how long somebody might have been looking after their peat bog and using it. Again, unfortunately with this photograph, it doesn't actually say where it is in Camp, so if anyone can guess from that photo, please let us know. But this is just an example, unfortunately, the other side of coming with peat, whilst it being very useful, necessary fuel, it also had risks involved, and this is just an example of a peat slip in Camp, possibly West Falkland.
So leading on from the destructive force that peat can have and the impact it can have, so this is actually images from the first ever peat slip to occur, and that occurred on the 29th of November 1978, and you can see that it's basically around 18. And you can see how the destructive force, it came down like Philomel Hill, and you know, it would have just been liquid peat that would have just been running down, and you know, it's luckily for this one it didn't cause any loss of life, but you know, the destruction was being quite heavily, and it was going to impact on people. Here is an extract from the second peat slip that occurred, and unfortunately there were 2 losses of life in this particular incident. Here we have Mr. Cobb, who was the FIC manager at the time. This extract that he's provided actually features in one of the periodicals that we have, again all available on the website, but he writes about his recollections of the event itself. I can actually read it. So a horrible calamity has occurred last night where at least one person has been lost and great damage done to property. It started from the top of the hill and descended with immense force to the harbour, moved one house several yards and nearly overturned it, smashed all fencing and walls that stood in its way. The church is half buried and the back wall cracked and bulged, so it's unsafe. And the lad Radcliffe, it was actually David Radcliffe, who was aged 7 at the time, when trying to escape with the first rush, was caught in some wire fencing, and although several people had hold of him and nearly lost their own lives trying to rescue him, he was horribly smothered. The liquid peat is nearly up to the ceiling in the kitchen, and he also remarks that the inmates escaped just in time and took refuge in my house, in his house. So again, it's just unfortunately showing the other side of it, the other unfortunate person who deceased was a 54-year-old male. And so actually from that event you can then see, this is the second peat slip that occurred, so you can see kind of the destruction that would have been around the church area and kind of the wall that he referenced. And then this is from the first peat slip. And again, it just shows the destructive nature of peat and how lucky we are that it doesn't occur in these modern times. And then this is a really fascinating watercolour that's done again of the first peat slip. But so it's kind of a different visual presentation of that event, but I particularly love this because it also provides a great snapshot of Stanley at that particular time, so we can all recognise some of the really obvious buildings that we have. We've got we do have the FIC manager's house, obviously now Stanley House, we have Marmot Row, we have the barracks and the church, but obviously not quite the same development as there is nowadays. So it's great to be able to see just how far and how extreme standing has developed in this time. And for us, it kind of again gives a great snapshot as historians as to what was there at that time. So it's one of my favourites.
And we do have some records pertaining to Peat Cutting Monday as well. So as we know, that's a bank holiday, and the idea sort of behind it was that early October is the time that you should start cutting your peat, that's sort of springtime, and it gave people an opportunity to sort of officially mark the start. Bearing in mind as well, a lot of people would have to be cutting peat early in the morning or straight after work. I've heard stories of people going up in their suits after work to start cutting their peat. But there's a little bit of information about how Executive Council approving that decision to make it a public holiday. Though in 1992 they decided to replace it with it being the 400th anniversary of the first sighting of the Falklands. They decided to change it to the 14th of August, so sort of Falklands Day. And then again in 1992 they actually decided to reverse that decision and go back to Peat Cutting Monday in October in 2002. Yeah.
So alongside the other archive collections that we've mentioned, we also have the periodicals, which all can be found on the website. But the screenshots on this slide just show some varied adverts that mention peat. So we've got some for Strong Peat Boy wanted at Waverley House, some notices from the church asking for one or more loads of peat as a gift of practical Christianity. The bottom right one is particularly interesting. It reads, Leslie Clethero wishes to inform his customers that the rumour going around town that he sold his lorry and giving up the peat is absolutely untrue. And it also contains some season news, so this would just be of interest for what's happening in any particular peat season, to those that are involved with direct impact on their lifestyles and livelihoods. So it includes the possibility of the peat wax industry, the difficulties faced to transport, any new machinery. My personal favourite at the top there is from the church bulletin, and it says, things we should like to know. Number 1, who is stealing the peat from the peat bogs and can he not be caught? And then also we've got some other interesting and just fun mentions of peat within the periodicals. These include a poem which references the darling peat of the Falklands, recipes that require no baking in times of peat shortage on the woman's page, adverts for the perfect cooling drink after a long day at the peat bogs, and also a hand-drawn cartoon of Kelper Sam, who's carting his peat from the back as he can't stand to look at it. These just really show how embedded in everyday life and culture peat was for the Falklands.
And we also have some farm diaries within our collection, so non-government related, and this is just a snapshot of like a 2-week kind of period, but it shows again from a diary from Hill Cove exactly how much peat was part of the everyday, particularly because it's early part of the season, it's all to do with cutting and rickling, but we see it throughout the diaries how much peat is referenced, and again it's just a core part of what it's the core points of what people were doing every single day, and that needed to be noted down.
So as we've sort of discussed the way through, we've got lots of government records pertaining to peat. A lot of these are available online from our website, including the photographs and the plans, but there are also some things that you would have to come and view in person that haven't been digitised yet. And then you could book an appointment with us to request to view those. So that's things like building documentation, where they discuss like alteration to peat sheds and permission to do so. And we also have some of the youngsters, Alistair Camerons, that have written over time about cutting peat, so there's a few nice ones in there, and a lot of things in this list we've already discussed, so I won't talk about them again, but lots of interesting stuff.
Who knew there'd be so much about peat in the archives? And so in a minute we will just show you briefly kind of our website and how you can explore and navigate that to find any information that you are after. I will just say we've already referenced several times in terms of our newsletter. So we have a email circulation list where we provide people with kind of bi-monthly service updates about what we've been up to, but also you get a list of all the individual digitised documents that we've uploaded to the website, so you can kind of see exactly what's most up to date on there. We've got a few sign-up sheets around the room, but I'll put them in a more prominent place so that if you want to add yourselves to our list, then you can receive all this news. And again, if you don't have any questions, then you can always contact us at any time, and we'll have our contact details on the slide. So if I then just, I'll stop sharing that. Get our board. Yes. Come on. Yeah, here we go. Right. So on our, I might recognise my finger. Okay, maybe not. Thank you for being all patient with us with the technical. No, it isn't completely. There we go. Okay, right. So this is our archives website, and we have an extensive amount of material, probably between 6,000 to 8,000 records that we've actually digitised and put on our website. All the individual documents that are on there, you can search by keyword. So everything that's been uploaded has had optical character recognition. So you just have to do Control F and you can search for any keyword for that type of document that you have opened, and you'll be able to find it. Very useful for when we've been searching for peat, I can tell you. And so particularly, I think for your group, and you'll here be most interested in potentially work will be in our natural history and mineral resources. And so this is where we have obviously natural history will go into lots of other things relating to the sealing industry.
It's doing it.
Ta-da! So we have, scroll up, we have everything to do with the flora and fauna. We have upcoming bits on geography, penguins and penguin seals and sealings. So we have a vast collection there. Helen, if you want to press the back button, I'll go there. And then in the mineral resources section, we have that's where we put all the kelp records and government reports that we have just been digitising.
The oil's still to be done yet, but
Yes.
will be added to that section.
So here you can then get access to everything that you need. As I said, there's so much material here. We could do another hour's presentation just talking and kind of going through your different interests that you might have. But our website has just been redeveloped, so now we're also very excited to say that we actually have a search bar, hurrah! But also it means that if you then put any keywords or anything in there, then it will also come up, hopefully, with any documents that might, again, have that particular search word. So a lot of hard work has been done behind the scenes to kind of get it to where it needs to be, and hopefully, hopefully we'll have chance to actually explore it for yourselves and be able to get the information that you are looking for. Right. Presentation. No, you don't want to do it, that's fine. Okay. There you go. I should say thank you very much to Helen for being able to click through the screen. So the next slide, please. So this next slide will just show exactly where we've been. Yes. And again, just to reiterate, so we are open most of the time during the working week. We do say we're closed on Wednesdays. We do offer services over lunchtime and over weekends on request to kind of work around people's working schedules. So if you should ever want to, as we've said, come in person and have a bit more of an in-person explore of any of our records, then you're completely free to do so, and we'd encourage it, in fact. As we said, also explore our online resources, because we've worked very hard to try to make as much information kind of readily available as possible. And so we've got our newsletter coming up, so we have our little sign-up sheets here, so we've got some on the tables, so please sign up if you would like to receive that, and we have got our business cards by the food, so again with our email address and contact details, just in case. And yeah, I think that's basically the end of our presentation. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Helen and Emma Jane, because they've done a marvellous job. Emma Jane in particular, because she's been helping to digitise the records, as she said, and it's just been a pleasure hosting her. Thank you, Helen, for being able to actually move the slides, and also thank you to Josh, our official photographer for today, who's been hovering around and taking photos. But really, thank you guys for reaching out and asking us to come here. We're not subject matter experts in this, we just kind of present the material that you can explore yourselves, but hopefully you've enjoyed it. So, thank you.
It's been really brilliant, thanks ever so much, and looks like our Peat had a lucky escape from all being shipped away. That's good. We maybe just check if the Teams people have got a question, and if not, we can take some questions from here, so I'm sure there are all plenty. And will you come back next year and do one on tussock?
Oh, maybe, yes. Okay. Excellent.
I put the wrong camera.
No, I don't think they can see us.
Okay.
My horrendous spelling, but never mind. I say it's great to see so many of you. We were a bit hesitant as to how many we might get. So.
Yes, thanks so much for coming. In the meantime, yes, go ahead.
So they kept talking about how many loads were delivered, this load, this car. Is that an official measure, or like what was it?
Well, there's some argument about that. I think they did write down in there is some discussion around it, but then they were sort of arguing that one of the lorries that FIG had was not the same size as another, and there was a bit of discussion about how that was maybe unfair. But I think they did sort of have a rough standard size that they recommended for each load.
And what's also almost a bit bizarre is that we only really have one particular document that's labelled as a register as well for Peat. It's almost like the other years they kind of just didn't necessarily record it, or at least nothing that we have. But
there's a heated discussion in one of the boxes between the government auditor and the superintendent of public works, who clearly didn't like each other at all, but they were arguing about the fact that sometimes the drivers weren't logging that they'd done the deliveries, and then people were saying they hadn't got peat, or it had gone to the wrong place, or it wasn't the right amount, and they were sort of arguing about how record keeping might mitigate that issue.
And then there was that one thing where who was stealing the peat. Are there records about people? Was there a lot of theft of peat, or people that were taking other people's peat?
I mean, it didn't really come up too often.
Yes,
I think that's why.
There was.
Well, I mean,
It was
in our
the
records
biggest
anyway.
crime you can almost commit in the corporate. Stealing somebody's wife actually didn't equate.
Sorry, Brian, I should have said in our records at least. Which is why that particular one kind of stood out for us and was quite funny. But I mean, as you can see from the periodicals as well, and the screenshots that we took, obviously it was, at times people would then take so much offence that they would publicly shame whoever it was for having done so.
Any more questions?
I'd just like to make a comment on the 1950s peat machine. It didn't actually mention that it got horribly bogged and was completely abandoned, and it produced sausages. They were about the size of cans of beans, and I remember it actually at IJS. That was one of the places where the peat was delivered to, but it got bogged down to the east of Eliza Cove, and the remains of that is about 500 metres along the coast, and it is still there and visible, but it had originally disappeared in the peat down there.
Wow. Oh, that's amazing. Wow.
And
And it's
also,
recognisable because it's got these tubes. I think there's 5 or 6 tubes, and you can see where there's somebody had actually cut off the towing hitch and what have you, but it is still there.
John Paul Evans' granddad, he had been cutting his peat, or he was getting his peat in when the Falklands was invaded, and the mines, fields were, and everything was there. And so forever and ever, there was his peat stack with his peat shovel in it. that was stuck in the middle of a minefield.
Yeah, and that's my granddad, and so when the minefields got removed, that was one of the first things that me, mum and dad did, was to
Go and get the
find the Anderson massive peat bog. And yeah, it's amazing, and you can see where like my granddad has like cut it obviously, and yeah, it's amazing, and for me, until they removed the minefields, that's a bit of my history that I'd never been able to access. So it's great to look at the maps and plans that we've picked out, because you can then see all the different allocations and everything, and that's like, oh yes, that's exactly where like our families and had their allocations. Yeah, it's great.
I mean, it's not a question, it's just a comment. I mean, I think it is such a fantastic resource. I haven't gone in and looked at anything at Peat, but I had done a little dive into tussock and gorse fires a few years ago. And if you take out the esteemed gentleman or your most humble servant, it could have been pretty much written, 2 months ago, because it's just still so current. It's like, Jesus, it's 100 years ago, and we're saying exactly the same thing.
Things never
Yeah,
change.
that is amazing.
Could you tell us just a bit about the process? How does someone get into the archives? Like, if, how?
Yeah, sure.
Things
So
like those in there.
we encourage that if anyone's, so our collections remit is quite wide because we are the National Archives. But if you would like to donate any material, then we ask that we have an appointment with you in advance, mainly so we can go through the things that you're looking to donate. From there, we can then kind of assess it, both in terms of conservation needs, in terms of what it would need once it gets formally transferred over, but also for us to be able to say, yes, we can accept it at a particular time. There's a lot of formal paperwork that lots of people don't necessarily consider, we have documentation and paperwork that's basically like a formal agreement between yourself as a donor and the National Archives that basically goes over the legal and physical transfer from the donator to the archives. Once everything gets put into the archives, that's when for us the hard work starts. We make sure that everything has its own unique identifier, so it gets catalogued, and we take into account all the important information that's relating to that particular document, its provenance, again relating to information about conservation requirements, date ranges, and anything that we can then reproduce to make it more accessible to researchers. Digitisation isn't necessarily a day-to-day occurrence that lots of archives necessarily perform. They, in the UK, tend to do it on a kind of an individual request basis, whereas we're kind of, a bit more accessibility by default, in trying to make people kind of more able to access what is your history. But we're happy to talk about any kind of documents. As you can see, we have a wide range, so it's probably easier sometimes to say things that we might not accept than what we do. But I mean, honestly, if you have any collection of farm diaries from your, from your family, photographs or anything, then yeah, we're always happy to have that initial chat and then go for it. We also are really keen for people to come and have a look or visit the archives on appointments, so that we can also hopefully do some more tours, so that we can show the behind the scenes and also how we take care of these records, because we have a dedicated storage resource which is environmentally controlled, so anything that is accepted into our responsibility, into our ownership, will never leave the building once it comes into our holdings. That's so that we can protect it. So we have temperature and humidity that's controlled, access and security is controlled, so that everything is, as long as there's a Falkland, as long as there's a history, it should be accessible. So we take our jobs very seriously.
So it's the same question, really. Obviously, you kind of think of, the historical documents on one side, but I guess the record keeping is ongoing, and you can't save everything. One, how do you judge what is important? Because very often, just now, we don't know what's going to be important in the future or what might be of interest in the future. And two, we just generate so much electronic chit-chat now and rubbish. I mean, how do you decide what of that is savable? Because in the past, a lot of the interesting bits are these kind of correspondences.
Yeah, no.
But now it's all done by email, across the whole of FIG, and you could say within sort of NGOs or other bodies as well. How on earth do you sort of decide what is worthwhile archiving and not?
It's very difficult. I'll take that answer in two parts. The first part I'd say as well is that when we are talking to people that are going to give us material, is that it's almost like a certain age criteria that we have, so we won't necessarily accept anything that's under 30 years old, so thankfully I can be accepted. But anyway, so we kind of take that into account because things might still be of current use and value to people, so we're not going to take that out of people's initial accessibility. The second part of that question is that with our work with FIG, which is it's quite hard for a team of two to be able to have oversight of all of this essentially. So another part of it is looking after the records management, but working with departments to make sure that they have record retention schedules to say how long they're meant to be keeping records, and identifying at what point it then comes to the National Archives. So we can start having those conversations early on to identify material. Obviously with high turnover of FIG staff, we also want to make sure that for anyone new coming in, they're not going to destroy anything that's potentially historic. So having that resource is really important. We then obviously have those conversations with departments, and as part of that work, we're then looking to develop how we store our electronic records to try to make that more efficient, to make sure that we're capturing it. Lots of people just think that digitising is really easy and then that's going to solve all our issues, but if they're born digital, that's obviously not going to be the solution. We also have to take into account digital preservation. We don't currently have the infrastructure or software to be able to have a current software in place, which is what we're, again, on our many to-do list, we're working towards and with the government. So we want to make sure that anything that we digitise or that we create or will get inputted into the archives that might be digital, that again that can be preserved for as long as these papers and physical records are. But it's a constant headache, and at least it's something that it isn't just unique to us. The whole archive profession is undergoing the same considerations. So that's why it's really important that we're able to connect with people to share experiences and resources. And this week actually we're virtually attending the annual Archives and Records Association's conference, so that we can learn from what other people are doing, and so just connect, really. Hopefully that has answered your question.
Any last question? You ready for it? No? Oh well, great. Thank you ever so much again. That's brilliant. Do visit the archive.